this just into CNN. The House Ways and Means Committee is now poised tonight to get former President Trump's IRS tax returns. A federal appeals court has just denied Trump's request to hold up the release. CNN senior justice correspondent Evan Perez is joining us right now. Evan, this is a victory for the House committee. How quickly will it actually get his tax returns?
As soon as a week from today, Wolf. This is what the appeals court has said. Unless the former president gets the Supreme Court to delay that, and it is possible that he'll appeal to the Supreme Court to try to fight this out longer, litigate this longer. What the appeals court says is that the IRS is now free within the next 7 days, in 7 days to...
Okay, so U.S. District Judge Beryl A. Howell just delivered what might be the most devastating legal blow yet to Trump's mass deportation agenda by issuing an 88-page preliminary injunction that halts the Trump administration's practice of conducting warrantless arrests of migrants in Washington, D.C., and the ruling is absolutely scathing in its condemnation of how immigration enforcement has been carried out, with what the judge called systematic failures to follow constitutional and legal requirements. We're talking about a federal judge who spent 88 pages meticulously documenting how Trump administration officials have been violating migrants' rights through warrantless arrests during routine daily activities, how detention facilities are so overcrowded that people are being denied basic necessities like food, water, and medical care, and how high-ranking officials, including Border Patrol Chief Gregory Bino, have been publicly lying about the legal standards that govern when immigration officers can arrest people without warrants. The ruling came down on December 3rd, 2025, and it represents Judge Howell, granting a preliminary injunction that was sought by migrants who had been arrested and who argued that the Trump administration's enforcement tactics violate constitutional protections against unreasonable seizures and violate statutory requirements for how immigration enforcement is supposed to be conducted. Come on, when a federal judge is writing 88 pages explaining in excruciating detail how the executive branch is systematically violating the law and the Constitution, and when that judge is imposing an injunction that effectively shuts down a major component of the president's signature policy agenda, that's not just another legal setback. That's the judiciary saying we will not allow this administration to continue trampling on people's rights no matter how much political pressure we face. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter, and we'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Search for the documents that Trump has not turned over. It sounds like they're probably negotiating over compliance with that original grand jury subpoena, and I really do hope that the department is not being too generous towards Trump in allowing them to negotiate a possible second search warrant. I mean, the whole point of the search warrant is you can't trust the people to turn over the documents, but it sounds like it's about the documents. And, you know, if this was a drug dealer, if it was a jewel thief, it'd be pretty obvious that you would search all of their residences. And they already searched one and found things that were being concealed. So I hope they will continue down that path, Wolf.
Well, we shall see. And Evan, does this mean, based on your reporting, that the Justice Department still believes the former president has government documents in his possession?
They continue to tell the former president's legal team, Wolf, that they believe that there are still documents missing. And the question is how...
The specific findings in Judge Howell's ruling are absolutely damning and show just how lawless Trump's immigration enforcement has become. According to the Washington Post's reporting on the 88-page decision, Judge Howell found that migrants were being detained while engaging in unavoidable, lawful daily activities like going to work, dropping kids at school, or buying groceries, and that immigration officers were conducting these arrests without warrants and without having the individualized reasonable suspicion that's required by the Fourth Amendment. The judge documented a systemic failure to follow the law, where Trump administration officials essentially abandoned any pretense of following constitutional and statutory constraints and just started arresting anyone they suspected of being undocumented, regardless of whether they had legal grounds to do so. The ruling details how people were being rounded up in mass sweeps, how families were being separated, and how detainees were being held in facilities that were so overcrowded and under-resourced that basic human needs weren't being met. When Judge Howell writes about detention centers denying necessities, she's talking about people being held without adequate food, water, medical care, or even basic sanitation, conditions that violate both constitutional requirements and international standards for humane treatment of detainees. The bombshell finding that high-ranking officials like Border Patrol Chief Gregory Bino publicly misrepresented the legal standards governing warrantless arrests is particularly significant because it shows this wasn't just frontline agents making mistakes or misunderstanding the law. This was top officials deliberately lying to the public and to their own personnel about what the law allows. Judge Howell's ruling apparently includes specific examples of Bino and other officials making public statements about when warrantless arrests are permitted that directly contradict what the law actually says and what courts have repeatedly held about Fourth Amendment protections. When senior officials are publicly lying about legal standards in ways that give their subordinates the impression they have more authority than they actually do, that's not just poor management. That's a deliberate strategy to evade legal constraints by creating confusion about what the law requires. The judge's finding that officials repeatedly misrepresented legal standards shows she believes this wasn't innocent error, but rather was intentional deception designed to provide cover for unlawful enforcement tactics. The connection to the D.C. National Guard shooting that happened just days before this ruling adds an incredibly important political context because Trump has been using that shooting to justify even more aggressive immigration enforcement, and now a federal judge is saying, actually, your current enforcement tactics are already so far beyond what the law allows that I'm shutting them down. The New York Times reported on how Trump blamed immigration policy for the shooting, where an Afghan asylum seeker allegedly shot National Guard members, and Trump used that incident to call for even harsher crackdowns and to attack anyone who questioned his immigration agenda as being soft on crime and endangering American lives. But Judge Howell's ruling came down right in the middle of that political firestorm and essentially said, regardless of whatever incidents are being used to justify aggressive enforcement, there are constitutional limits on what government can do, and warrantless mass arrests that violate people's Fourth Amendment rights are not permissible no matter what policy goals they're supposedly serving. The timing creates this incredible tension where Trump is demanding more aggressive enforcement while a federal judge is saying, you need to dial it back and follow the Constitution. The preliminary injunction that Judge Howell granted is a specific type of court order that prevents certain conduct while a case is pending. And it's only supposed to be issued when the plaintiffs can show they're likely to succeed on the merits of their legal claims and that they'll suffer irreparable harm if the conduct continues. The fact that Judge Howell granted this injunction means she looked at the evidence and legal arguments and concluded that migrants challenging these warrantless arrests have strong legal claims that are likely to prevail ultimately, and that the harm being caused by the unlawful arrests and inhumane detention conditions is so severe that it can't be adequately remedied after the fact through monetary damages or other post hoc relief. This is a significant legal conclusion because courts are generally cautious about issuing preliminary injunctions that interfere with executive branch enforcement operations. So when a judge does issue such an injunction, it's a sign that the legal violations are clear and serious. The systemic nature of the violations that Judge Howell documented in her 88-page ruling is really important because it shows this wasn't just a few isolated incidents or a few rogue agents exceeding their authority. This was a top-down policy where Trump administration officials deliberately chose to ignore legal constraints in service of maximizing the number of people they could arrest and deport. When Judge Howell writes about systemic failure to follow the law, she's saying that the problems she identified weren't aberrations, but rather were the predictable result of policies and practices that were designed and implemented at the highest levels of the administration. This finding makes it very difficult for Trump and his officials to claim they were just trying to enforce the law aggressively and that any violations were unintentional because the judge is saying the violations were built into how you designed and carried out this enforcement campaign. The political implications of this ruling coming right after the National Guard shooting are enormous because it undercuts Trump's ability to use that incident to justify unlimited immigration enforcement powers. Trump's whole political strategy on immigration has been to point to crimes committed by immigrants and to argue that anyone who opposes his enforcement tactics is essentially supporting criminal activity and putting Americans at risk. But Judge Howell's ruling shows that aggressive enforcement can itself violate the law and can harm innocent people who are just going about their daily lives, and that there's a constitutional balance that has to be maintained between enforcement goals and protection of individual rights. Democrats and immigration advocates are going to use this ruling to argue that Trump's enforcement tactics are not just aggressive, they're illegal and unconstitutional, and that defending constitutional rights is not the same as being soft on immigration enforcement. Let's dig into the specific legal standards that govern when immigration officers can conduct warrantless arrests, because understanding what the law actually requires helps explain why Judge Howell found the Trump administration's practices to be so clearly unlawful. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, which means that in general, law enforcement officers need either a warrant or an exception to the warrant requirement before they can arrest someone. For immigration enforcement specifically, federal statutes and Supreme Court precedents have established that immigration officers can conduct warrantless arrests in some circumstances, but only when they have probable cause to believe the person is an alien who is in the United States illegally and who is likely to escape before a warrant can be obtained. The key word there is probable cause, which is a legal standard that requires specific facts and circumstances that would lead a reasonable person to believe the person being arrested is in fact removable from the United States. What Judge Howell found in her ruling is that Trump administration officials were conducting arrests without having probable cause and were instead using much lower standards like reasonable suspicion or even just hunches based on people's appearance or where they were located. The ruling apparently details numerous examples of people being arrested solely because they looked Hispanic or were in neighborhoods with high immigrant populations, without officers having any individualized information suggesting those specific people were actually in the country illegally. This kind of racial profiling and dragnet enforcement is exactly what the Fourth Amendment is supposed to prevent, because it subjects innocent people to government intrusion based on group characteristics rather than on individualized evidence of wrongdoing. When immigration officers are arresting people just for looking a certain way or being in certain places, that's not targeted law enforcement. That's discrimination and harassment that happens to catch some people who are actually deportable, but that also sweeps up many people who are citizens or lawful residents who just happen to fit officers' profiles. The public misrepresentations by Border Patrol Chief Bino and other officials that Judge Howell called out in her ruling are particularly troubling because they show a deliberate effort to mislead both the public and immigration officers themselves about legal requirements. According to the ruling, Bino and other officials made public statements suggesting that immigration officers have much broader authority to conduct warrantless arrests than the law actually provides, and they failed to correct officers who were conducting unlawful arrests based on these misunderstandings. When the person in charge of Border Patrol is publicly saying things about warrantless arrest authority that aren't true, that creates an environment where frontline agents think they're operating within the law when they're actually violating constitutional rights. Judge Howell apparently found that these misrepresentations were not innocent mistakes, but were instead part of a strategy to provide political cover for aggressive enforcement by making it seem like everything being done was lawful when in fact it wasn't. The detention conditions that Judge Howell documented in her ruling raise serious humanitarian concerns beyond just the Fourth Amendment issues with the arrests themselves. The ruling describes detention facilities that are operating far beyond their capacity, with people being held in spaces that were designed for much smaller numbers and for much shorter periods of time. Detainees are reportedly being denied adequate food, sometimes going many hours without meals, being denied access to clean drinking water, being held in unsanitary conditions without adequate bathroom facilities, and being denied necessary medical care even when they have serious health conditions. When you combine overcrowding with lack of basic necessities, you create conditions that are not just uncomfortable, but that pose serious health and safety risks, especially for vulnerable populations like children, elderly people, and people with medical conditions. Judge Howell's finding that these conditions violate constitutional standards suggests she believes they rise to the level of cruel and unusual punishment or deliberate indifference to serious medical needs, which are very serious constitutional violations. The scope of the preliminary injunction that Judge Howell issued is important to understand because it tells us exactly what the Trump administration is and isn't allowed to do going forward while the case is pending. Based on the reporting, the injunction appears to prohibit immigration officers from conducting warrantless arrests in Washington, D.C., unless they have probable cause that the person is removable and likely to escape before a warrant can be obtained. And it requires officials to improve detention conditions to meet constitutional minimums. The geographic limitation to D.C. means that technically this injunction doesn't apply to immigration enforcement in other parts of the country, though other courts could issue similar injunctions if presented with similar evidence. The Trump administration is going to try to limit the impact of this ruling by arguing it only applies in one district and that enforcement can continue everywhere else. but immigration advocates are going to use Judge Howell's detailed findings as a roadmap for bringing similar challenges in other jurisdictions. The precedent implications of Judge Howell's ruling are significant because her 88-page opinion provides a comprehensive analysis of what the Fourth Amendment requires in immigration enforcement contexts and how courts should evaluate whether particular enforcement tactics cross constitutional lines. Other judges handling similar challenges to Trump's immigration enforcement are going to look to Judge Howell's opinion for guidance, and her detailed factual findings about how the Trump administration actually carried out these enforcement operations are going to be cited in other cases. The ruling essentially creates a blueprint for challenging Trump's immigration tactics by showing what kind of evidence needs to be gathered and what legal arguments are likely to succeed. Immigration lawyers across the country are going to be studying this opinion and using it to bring their own challenges to enforcement operations in their jurisdictions. The connection to the broader pattern of judicial pushback against Trump's immigration policies shows this is part of a larger story where courts across the country are pushing back against Trump's most aggressive tactics and are enforcing constitutional limits on executive power. We've covered multiple instances where judges have blocked or limited Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act, where contempt proceedings have been initiated against officials who defied court orders to halt deportations, and where Trump's immigration-related emergency declarations have been struck down. Judge Howell's ruling is another example of the judiciary serving its constitutional role as a check on executive overreach, and it shows that at least some judges are willing to stand up to political pressure and enforce the law even when doing so interferes with the president's priorities. The practical impact of this ruling on immigration enforcement in the D.C. area is going to be significant because it's going to force ICE and Border Patrol to change how they operate and to be much more careful about ensuring they have legal justification for arrests. Officers who were previously conducting sweeps based on ethnic appearance or neighborhood demographics are going to have to develop individualized probable cause before making arrests, which is going to slow down enforcement operations and reduce the number of arrests. Detention facilities that are currently overcrowded are going to have to either reduce intake or improve conditions to meet constitutional requirements, which could mean releasing people or transferring them to other facilities. All of these operational changes are going to require resources and planning, and they're going to make it harder for Trump to achieve his goal of dramatically increasing deportations in the short term. So what does Judge Howell's bombshell ruling actually mean for Trump's immigration agenda, for his political standing, and for the ongoing battle between the executive and judicial branches over immigration enforcement? Well, first and most obviously, this ruling represents a major legal and operational setback for Trump's deportation efforts in the nation's capital, and potentially beyond if other courts follow Judge Howell's lead. Trump came into his second term promising to conduct the largest deportation operation in American history, and a key component of that operation was aggressive street-level enforcement where immigration officers would fan out across cities and conduct mass arrests. Judge Howell's ruling says you can't do that without following constitutional requirements for probable cause and without ensuring humane detention conditions, which is going to significantly constrain Trump's ability to operate the way he wants to operate. The fact that this is happening in D.C. is particularly embarrassing for Trump because it's the seat of government where federal authority is supposed to be at its strongest, and yet a federal judge is saying Trump's immigration enforcers are violating the law right in his own backyard. The erosion of Trump's strongman image that results from this judicial defeat is significant because Trump's entire political brand is built on being tough and on getting things done regardless of obstacles. When federal judges are blocking his immigration enforcement and calling out his officials for systematically violating the law, that undercuts the narrative that Trump is an effective leader who can deliver on his promises. Trump can blame judges and claim they're being political. But the reality is that Judge Howell wrote 88 pages of detailed legal analysis showing why Trump's tactics are unconstitutional, which is not something that can be easily dismissed as judicial activism or partisan bias. The fact that Trump is sitting at 36% approval ratings shows that his aggressive tactics are not resonating with the broader public the way he hoped, and judicial defeats like this one are contributing to a sense that Trump is chaotic and ineffective rather than strong and decisive. The igniting of GOP base rage that's going to result from this ruling is predictable because Trump's hardcore supporters view any judicial constraint on immigration enforcement as unacceptable and as evidence of activist judges undermining the will of the people. Conservative media is going to hammer Judge Howell and is going to call for her impeachment or removal, and there's going to be enormous pressure on congressional Republicans to do something to overturn the ruling or to punish judges who issue rulings like this. But the problem for Republicans is that there's not much they can actually do. Congress can't overturn individual court rulings, and impeaching federal judges for issuing rulings you disagree with would set a terrible precedent and would undermine judicial independence. So GOP base voters are going to be frustrated that their representatives can't fix this problem, which creates more internal tension within the Republican coalition. The ammunition this provides for Democrats in the 2026 midterms is substantial because they can point to a federal judge's detailed findings about Trump administration officials violating the Constitution and lying to the public about legal standards. Democrats don't have to make vague claims about Trump being lawless. They can cite a specific 88-page court opinion that documents systematic violations of constitutional rights. The debate about immigration enforcement is going to shift from just being about policy preferences to being about whether Trump should be allowed to violate the Constitution in service of his policy goals. And that's terrain where Democrats have a significant advantage with moderate and independent voters. When the choice is framed as constitutional rights versus Trump's deportation agenda, most swing voters are going to choose constitutional rights. The rights versus security framing that this ruling highlights is going to be central to political debates about immigration going forward. Trump and Republicans want to frame immigration enforcement as purely a security issue, where the only question is how aggressively we should act to protect Americans from criminal immigrants. But Judge Howell's ruling shows that there's another dimension which is about protecting the constitutional rights of everyone in the country, including immigrants, and that aggressive enforcement that violates those rights is not acceptable no matter what security benefits it might provide. This framing actually resonates with a lot of voters who support immigration enforcement in principle, but who don't want it carried out in ways that violate fundamental American values about due process and equal protection under law. The practical limitations this ruling imposes on Trump's deportation blitz are going to frustrate his efforts to dramatically increase deportation numbers in the ways he promised during the campaign. If immigration officers have to have probable cause before conducting warrantless arrests, and if detention facilities have to meet constitutional standards for conditions, that's going to slow down operations and reduce the total number of people who can be processed through the system. Trump might be able to get around some of these constraints by getting warrants for arrests or by building more detention capacity, but those solutions require time and resources that the administration might not have. The net effect is that Trump's deportation numbers are going to be lower than he promised, which creates a political problem where he has to explain to his base why he's not delivering on his signature campaign promise. The future of this litigation and what happens next procedurally is important to understand because the preliminary injunction is just the first step in what's likely to be a long legal battle. The Trump administration is almost certainly going to appeal Judge Howell's ruling to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, arguing that she got the law wrong or that she abused her discretion in issuing the injunction. The appeals court will then decide whether to uphold the injunction, modify it, or reverse it entirely. Meanwhile, the underlying case continues in Judge Howell's court, where there will eventually be a trial on the merits to determine whether permanent relief should be granted. All of this litigation is going to take months or years to fully resolve, and in the meantime, Trump's immigration enforcement in D.C. is going to be constrained by the preliminary injunction. The bottom line is this: Judge Beryl A. Howell's 88-page preliminary injunction blocking warrantless immigration arrests in Washington, D.C. represents a devastating legal blow to Trump's mass deportation agenda and exposes systematic violations of constitutional rights by Trump administration officials who the judge found were lying to the public about legal standards and operating detention facilities in inhumane conditions. The ruling came at a particularly sensitive time right after the D.C. National Guard shooting, where Trump was using that incident to justify even more aggressive enforcement, and it represents the judiciary pushing back and saying there are constitutional limits that have to be respected regardless of political pressure or security concerns. Trump's fate on immigration enforcement has been significantly constrained by this ruling because it's going to force operational changes that slow down arrests and reduce deportation numbers, and it's going to provide a legal template for challenges in other jurisdictions. The political implications are significant heading into the 2026 midterms, with the ruling eroding Trump's strongman image at a time when his approval is already at 36%, igniting GOP base rage that congressional Republicans can't easily address, and providing Democrats with detailed judicial findings documenting Trump administration lawlessness that can be used effectively in campaign messaging. Whether Trump can find ways to work around this ruling, or whether it marks a turning point where judicial constraints become a more effective check on his immigration agenda, remains to be seen. But what's clear is that Judge Howell has drawn a line and said this far and no further when it comes to constitutional violations in service of deportation goals.